Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Anders Kaur, one of the world's great authorities on the Chinese Communist Party, its strategic agenda, and the stakes for the rest of us if it succeeds at them. Anders, we were talking a bit about global domination, whether for ideological or simply power considerations. And the Chinese are well advanced, I think far more so than most of us are aware of as a result of this Belt and Road business. We did a study with the Committee on the Present Danger of China, and I want to thank you for mentioning our letter to the chairman of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board in the previous segment. But we did a study last year of the Belt and Road Initiative, and I was astonished to discover that something like 145 countries out of a total of about 190 are actually now in some way, shape, or form hooked up with this Chinese sort of colonial empire building operation. But a piece of this is a kind of digital counterpart. And I don't just mean the sort of Huawei telephonic and internet and undersea cables and all the rest of that. I'm talking also about what flows through what might be called the digital grid. I think the Chinese are sort of developing initially as the national uh, data sort of network in China. Um, Talk a bit about the importance of data to a hegemonic power like China and what kind of dominance it might contribute to.
Well, all major corporations, governments around the world need data in order to survive and thrive. China is no exception, except that it's a totalitarian fascist country. It's increasingly centralized in its powers and its approach to control. Now, what China's doing in terms of data is it's sucking up as much data as possible within China, but it's also seeking to suck up data globally through the provision, for example, of cloud services, of Huawei telephone cell towers. So basically, any way that 5G, any way that China can get your data, they will. And we know that they steal. So we know that they've stolen up to 600 billion a year in intellectual property from the United States alone. They get that from a lot of it from their electronic eavesdropping. So what they're trying to do now is centralize all this data for China, starting with China, and they would then move that model out to the rest of the world when they have capability. But in China, they're thinking about having just one big computer in which all of the data goes, all of the data is processed, and of course, these would be distributed computing. So you have computing data centers around the country, eventually around the world. All the data would be flowing in there. It would all be crunched, assessed, regressed, statistically analyzed, and out would come, for example, who the CCP thinks are the good guys and who the CCP thinks are the bad guys. And if you're a bad guy on their social credit score, you're not going to be able to get airplane tickets. You're not going to be able to get train tickets. You're not going to be able to vote, even when voting doesn't count.
Hmm.
So,
Well, or
it's
it may
a very
govern
dangerous
even
system.
employment and access, who knows, to food, depending on how badly they
Yeah.
want to
No
push it.
educational loans.
Yeah.
And it also has family effects. They can stop educational loans to your kids just because you weren't strong enough in your support for the Chinese Communist Party at the
Right.
last community meeting.
And this is of concern, Anders, as I know you appreciate, because that social credit system is actually being exported globally too. So it's not just that they're acquiring data, and I'd add to your litany health data. They've been hoovering that up massively in the expectation that that will enable them to dominate, the medical sphere in the future, among other things. There's also, by the way, as I'm sure all these genealogical um, studies where you just take a swab and give somebody your DNA. Boom. Many of them are, tied into the Chinese apparatus, I think, as well. So when you put all this together, and it's not just, of course, the aggregation of the data; it's the, as you say, the mining of it, the quantum computing, the artificial intelligence, and then the manipulation of it for various purposes that makes this so formidable. And I think it's clearly the Chinese vision, is it not, that they are looking to this as a decisive factor in their global competitiveness. Again, not just commercially, but in terms of political and military power as well.
That's right. They believe that their social control systems are so powerful that they're going to make them be able to outcompete the West, which they see as chaotic and disorganized and therefore weak. That's their view on things, and you could see it every day in Shanghai now. Their approach to COVID and how they're dealing with it. They're it's complete social control of people in COVID lockdown jails, essentially. And they're trying to probably do the impossible, which is get rid of Omicron, which is so contagious that I don't think even the CCP is going to be able to stamp it out.
Right. But it is establishing a model for the rest of the world as to how they're supposed to contend with these things. And as we were talking about earlier in the program with Congressman Pete Hoekstra, there's a move afoot, driven, not surprisingly, I'm sure, by the Chinese communists and certainly their puppet at the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, um, of using, sort of a pretext of pandemics to justify world governance through the WHO, including the ability to pronounce health emergencies and have every country forced to follow the dictates of the WHO. It's mind-boggling. It sounds, like some wild conspiracy theory, but they're actually negotiating the terms of this kind of arrangement as we speak. Listen, before we run out of time, Anders, I did want to ask you about one other thing because it goes back to something you touched on earlier, and that is the theft of intellectual property that is also fueling much of what the Chinese are up to. And it, you talked in another, I believe, piece at the Epoch Times about their using espionage essentially to steal, um, well, scientific and other data from talents, as they call them. The Taiwanese have interestingly set a sort of model for how you counter that. Talk a little bit about that and why we should follow their lead.
Yeah, the Taiwanese are really increasing the penalties if they catch a spy, an industrial spy, and you've got a lot of Chinese mainland spies who are focused, kind of acting as talent scouts to try to steal away Taiwanese scientists and engineers, especially from TSMC, the computer chip manufacturing company, because that's a world class chip company. And if they can get that engineering expertise, then they're going to be able to build their own chips. And then we're really in trouble. So they've got very tough, in Taiwan, they've got very, very tough laws against that. And I think that the US and other Western countries, Japan, should look to Taiwan as a model for how to deal with China's talent spies. We just can't let our talent, our science, our engineering be used by the CCP against us.
I couldn't agree with you more. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of reason to believe that they are getting away with that. In fact, Dr. Lawrence Sellen has reported extensively on the extent to which they're deeply embedded in our research institutions, laboratories, scientific centers across this country, including even People's Liberation Army officers, no less. This is a topic to which I hope we'll be able to return with you soon. Next up, we will speak with Reggie Littlejohn.